Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to Hilaal Live. My name is Faraz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us, and of course, my colleague Luqman Shadrack for taking you through that first part of the show. Now, tomorrow, all eyes will be on Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana, who will deliver his 2024 budget speech in Cape Town. He will outline government's prioritizers in its planned expenditure. These include financial, economic, and social commitments. Joining us now to discuss this and looking ahead to that budget speech, I'd like to welcome the Head of Investment Solutions at Absa Private Wealth Banking, Khanyisa Ngesi. Khanyisa, good day. Thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal Live.
Thanks for having me, Faraz.
It's an absolute pleasure. Khanyisa, should South Africans start to feel a bit worried ahead of tomorrow's speech?
Look, I think it's going to be a difficult one and quite a fine line and balancing act that the minister will have to do. I mean, we are currently faced with consumers that are heavily under pressure. We've got a government fiscal and infrastructure deficits. We have potential fiscal consolidation that may have a significant impact and a negative impact with regards to reducing spending on core public services. So it will be very interesting to see how the minister approaches this medium-term budget policy speech.
Khanyisa, you mentioned it's going to be difficult, and I guess looking at, given what the IMF has said in terms of our GDP growth, it does not look healthy at this moment. We have a rand that's hovering around the 19 rand per dollar currency exchange. Of course, so much can change, of course, before that speech tomorrow. But I think both you and I can agree that not much will happen. You've got, of course, the potential of a rising fuel cost, and we are going to get to, of course, that fuel levy in a bit. But just this is such a defining speech for Godongwana, given that not only is it, one which determines how the pockets will be of ordinary South Africans, but also from a political perspective, this is going to be a key one for the ANC and their macroeconomic policies, which have really been put under the microscope, ever since President Cyril Ramaphosa came into power in 2018.
No, 100%. I mean, it is an election year, and I think that's the key driver of what we will potentially hear in tomorrow's budget speech. I think the ruling party and government obviously is very much aware of that, and the things that citizens and corporations that function within the ambit of that want to hear. But I think at the end of the day, there's what we want to hear and the very tough decisions that potentially government needs to make, i.e. is there potential for any VAT or personal income tax or even corporate income tax increases? What will happen with the fuel levy, for example? Et cetera, et cetera. So to your point, again, as I highlighted, a very fine line between making very tough and potentially unpopular decisions, but also making sure that those fiscal and infrastructure deficits are somehow funded to be able to ensure that government creates an environment which is conducive to growth for consumers and corporates alike. Obviously will be very difficult in light of the fact that there are a lot of exogenous factors that come into play that have, for example, caused our central bank to have to hike interest rates because of rampant, not only local, but global inflation, etc.
Khanyisa, let's look at the energy crisis, and I want to focus on that because as we, as both you and I speak right now, it's currently on stage 2. Who knows what will happen? It may be in favor of us, or it may just turn completely against us with higher stages of load shedding. I bring this point up because there's the potential of private energy investment. Is this something that you foresee Godongwana potentially speaking about tomorrow, given that there's this complete push for the just energy transition and a more greener energy, which would lead to a much greener economy?
Look, there is potential for that. I mean, if we look at how, for example, businesses have responded to the lifting of the licensing threshold for embedded generation, National accounts data is actually showing a very sharp increase in investment in things like equipment and machinery, which we believe mostly reflects investment in alternative energy sources. So, I mean, it's harder obviously to see in real time, and some of these projects will probably take longer to come online. But the positive way to look at this is this will obviously alleviate the pressure on Eskom. I mean, if you look at the load shedding that we had last year relative to what we've seen for the first few, 2 or so months of the year, already we've seen significantly less load shedding than we did for the comparable period last year. I mean, obviously, uncertainty remains quite high with regards to load shedding intensity and volatility. And we've seen the different stages for the past few weeks since December last year. But I think if you look at it from a private sector investment strategy with regards to alternative energy, this can also make the economy more resilient over time and less reliant on the likes of Eskom.
Khanyisa, don't jinx us about which stages of load shedding we're going to be, because let me tell you why. I was at Sona 2 weeks ago. I spoke immediately to the Minister of Electricity, and you know what? 2 minutes later, we got told stage 4 load shedding. So hopefully we don't get higher stages of load shedding. Khanyisa, let's talk about the big question: VAT or personal income tax? Now, this is going to be quite the challenging one, because given the country's debt right now, given that government is borrowing more than it can afford, which is the route that Godongwana is going to take tomorrow, given that this is such a tricky situation, and also added to that, an election year?
For us, I would say best case scenario, neither. Whether it's personal income tax, whether it's VAT, which directly hits the likes of you and I and everyone else's pockets, or whether it's corporate income tax, neither of those three scenarios are favorable in the current environment. I mean, I highlighted the consumer distress that we're currently facing in our economy because of exogenous and local issues. If you look at last year for us, for example, we saw household consumption falling for 2 consecutive quarters last year, for the first time since 2009. And where we've seen crushing infrastructure deficits, and where the consumer was seen as a driver for economic growth. And that has completely slipped from focus. And if you look at the most recent data that's been published, consumer spending is under real pressure, with real consumption spending actually falling significantly. And the last time household consumption fell for at least 2 consecutive quarters, as I said, was in 2009. And remember, for us, this was at the height of the global financial crisis. So erosion of disposable income because of higher debt servicing costs, as we've seen because of rising interest rates, the muted wage growth that we've seen. I mean, generally, households have struggled to keep up with inflation, and this has weighed considerably on the ability of consumers spend and their willingness spend. So a short answer to your question, none of those are palatable. However, but we do know that a government needs to find a way to fund the deficit. And unfortunately, this may be one of the levers that they pull, albeit a very unpopular and unpalatable one, which will have a significant impact on consumer household expenditure and overall GDP growth and recovery.
Khanyisa, what's definitely not palatable is the fuel hike that we are about to get in March. Based on current, Central Energy Fund predictions, over R1 as we talk right now. But for the last 2 years, Treasury has avoided, rising the fuel levy. Surely for a third year in a row, they're not going to do. They have to increase it, isn't it? Is that going to be something that Treasury is looking at and saying, well, we've kind of escaped it for the 2 years, but this year, well, things may need to change?
Absolutely, Faraz. I mean, as you've highlighted, and the Road Accident Fund levy was also in a similar situation. So it also saw no increases in 2022 and 2023. And just to remind our viewers, the reason for the relief in part was because of the continuation of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which resulted in significant supply chain bottlenecks and sort of unfavorable changes in two key drivers of regulated petrol price, which is the exchange rate and global oil prices. So what happened then is that we saw larger than um, anticipated increases in fuel prices, and obviously a temporary relief was provided. But I think what's actually important to note for us is that if you look at the revenue that was foregone from the extension of that relief, the fiscus actually lost about 4.5 billion rand. So to your point, unlikely that the minister would want to have that type of significant loss in potential collection of revenue to be able to fund government expenditure.
Khanyisa, the public service, of course, carries a lot of government spending, and it's been a discussion, obviously with the midterm budget policy statement that came out in November, and there have been talks leading up to tomorrow that there's that potential that government may need to cut spending. You mentioned the word unpopular earlier on. This is as more unpopular as it can ever get because, Godongwana is not just dealing with the public service sector, but he's also dealing with unions that also do represent them. Does he do that? Does he cut government spending given just how dire the fiscus is right now?
Well, for us, if he cuts government spending, so the what I'd call the low hanging fruit would obviously be at a core public sector service level, i.e., the core services that you and I and every citizen has that is coming from the fiscus, and hence why I said it would be unpopular, because we would feel this with regards to an increase in the pressure with regards to the infrastructure or lack thereof in terms of the infrastructure spending. And as I said, infrastructure deficit, if you can call it that, because we've got fiscal deficit, but we also have significant infrastructure deficit. So there are no popular decisions here that can be made, because if you look at our fiscal deficits, I mean, they remain quite wide, and we've got negative primary balances. And this is in part because of the spending targets and the significant SOE bailouts that have been quite high relative to the tax collections that we've actually received, which have underperformed budget targets, except for the 2 years after the pandemic when we obviously saw sky high commodity prices, which pumped up corporate income tax receipts. So as a consequence, our central government debt has obviously grown quite relentlessly, with the debt servicing costs consuming an even greater share of those tax collections. And then to add insult to injury, we've also seen the recent jump in higher interest rate, which has just compounded the problem, especially against the backdrop of sluggish growth. So these pressures have actually intensified the sort of fine line that government needs to walk between the fact that the government debt has mounted steadily, but also the tax collections that obviously government needs to be able to service that debt is not performing according to what the government would like. So yes, potential cuts with regards to public service in terms of the spending that goes there. I'm very doubtful for us that government would go the route of tempering too much with the agreements that they've had with regards to public service employees, because that would have a significant impact again in an election year with regards to sentiment and how that would be viewed. One thing for us that isn't spoken a lot about is that there is potentially a utilization of the SARB's big surplus position in what we call GFECRA. Now, GFECRA is the Gold and Foreign Exchange Contingency Reserve Account. It is a possible source of financing for the fiscus. And in very simplistic terms, what this account contains is that it contains the unrealized rand-denominated revaluations gains on the SARB's gold and foreign exchange reserves. Now, the caveat that I need to put there is that obviously there are several important monetary and political policy and economic issues that need to be considered before this account is dipped into. But this could potentially be a source of funding for government, potentially in debt servicing, and could then alleviate the need to potentially cut spending where it is required, i.e., in public service delivery, for example.
Yeah, it'll definitely not be popular with some of the opposition parties, especially the Democratic Alliance, who have said, stay away from those gold reserves. Khanyisa, unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal Live. Much appreciated. We hope to have you soon.
Thank you, Faraz.
That's Khanyisa Ngesi. She is the head of investment solutions at Absa Private Wealth Banking. Of course, tomorrow you can catch that budget speech by Minister Enoch Godongwana live here on Hilaal TV. After the break, I have your latest in news, finance, and sports. Do stay tuned.